At every moment of our lives, something that is always present, that no matter what else is going on, we're always experiencing our own mind and the processes and contents of the mind. And understanding the nature of the mind is really the first step towards wisdom. We take it completely for granted generally, and the contents of the mind very often become a cause of problems. Now, we can experience unpleasant emotional states. We can have misleading or obsessive thoughts. There's many ways in which we can suffer from the contents of the mind, the processing of information and so forth that's happening in the mind. The contents of the mind, what I'm calling the contents of the mind, the Dhammas or the Cetasikas in Pali, they are a constant companion in whatever we do. There's a stream of mental events happening. These can be categorized in various ways. One traditional list in the Abhidhamma has 50 different cetasikas, or objects of consciousness, mental events, categorized in 50 different ways. Broadly speaking, there's thought, there's emotion, there's will or intention, there's perception. And these things, like all other sankharas, compounded things, they are the nature to be dependently arisen. They arise according to lawful processes, cause and effect. They can be understood. When people first begin to meditate and to examine methodically the contents of their mind, it can often seem like a jumbled mess. A number of occasions I've had somebody come to do a retreat at our river, and if it's their first serious attempt at prolonged meditation, very often about the third day, they'll come and tell me they think they're going crazy because of the jumble of thoughts that they're aware of. I remember one woman who described it. I thought it was very apt description. She said it's like there's half a dozen radios in the cabin, all tuned to different stations and fading in and out. This is not madness. This is not going crazy. This is becoming aware, fully conscious for the first time of the actual contents of the mind. The ordinary, untrained mind is like that. It's a constant jumble. You know? The process of learning to deal with the mind is the process of bhavana, is the whole practice of meditation and the various practices that can be done. Just as we exercise the body to improve the tone and fitness of the body, so the mind can be improved with meditation. One formula has it that there's a three stages. First of all, knowing the mind, then shaping the mind, then freeing the mind. So first of all, we have to know what's going on with our mental processes. When we look at them methodically, which is one very important aspect of meditation, is looking at the contents of the mind in an objective way, we can see that any sankhara, any kind of mental event that arises, is first of all, it's impermanent. It comes and it goes. It's part of a flux, an ongoing stream of events. And it's dependently arisen. It means it arises according to cause and effect. It's not random. for whatever occurs in our mind, there is antecedents, there's roots that we've been fed since infancy, various sense impressions, and these store up in the mind and become the fodder for thought and emotion. One useful exercise that can be tried from time to time works best when you're sitting in meditation, but you can do it at any time. It's if you have a odd thought come into the mind that you say, well, where did that come from? Then examine, where did it come from? Retroactively run it back. I think, what was my mind doing immediately before this thought, and what was going on before that? And one thing you often find if you do that, one thing you often find is that it originates with a sense impression. That there's a sensation in the body, or a sound, or a smell, and this starts a chain of reactions until one thing leads to another, until you're quite far away from the original impulse. This is also a good exercise to take up if you find yourself sometimes getting distracted, losing the train of thought, or you're listening to someone and you kind of zone out, you're not understanding what they're saying. If you can stop mentally and trace it back and find out at what point did you jump ship, so to speak, what point was it broken. And I find that it's always a connection. Things are, there is some pattern going on. The most important aspect to notice of mental content is that they're empty. They're void of substance. It's all smoke and mirrors. There's nothing there. It's just purely mental event. There's no substance to it. There's an old exercise of asking yourself, or asking a meditator about the mind. Where is the mind? How big is it? How much does it weigh? What color is it? Questions like that, they're actually nonsensical. A great voidness, and the mind itself is empty, and the objects within the mind are empty. So it's empty both ways. When you come to appreciate that, and really on an experiential level, when it becomes instinct for you to see the mind and its contents as empty, it's tremendously liberating. And this is something that I think needs to be remembered often, and very good advice for dealing with the mental stream is to remember that it's empty, and not take it seriously. Not to believe the reality of your own thoughts and imaginations and emotional reactions. It's all just processes. Yeah? And also to see that there's nobody doing it. There's a book a Buddhist scholar wrote, a very good book about this, like a psychological look at Buddhism. He titled it "Thoughts Without a Thinker." And this is the underlying, most important teaching of the Buddha. The teaching unique to Buddhism is not self-teaching. That there's the self is not a real thing. It's not a real entity. It's only a conventional expression. As thought arises, and mind knowing thought, but there's nobody actually thinking. It's a process. When we look at the contents of the mind, we can see different categories, different types of processes going on. There's thought, memory, emotion, perception, intention, and many others. These are probably the most prominent ones. Thought is the processing of information. This is something that we all do continuously. Sometimes people think that the idea of meditation is to stop the thought process. And it is true that with diligent practice, the thought process will quiet down, but it's not something that you ought to try and do. You ought to, to deliberately throttle the thought process. You just let it run out. The idea is not to identify with it, to see it objectively as a process. Now, thought is a tricky one because it's, in terms of functioning, it's semi-autonomous. It's like breathing. If you ignore if you're doing something else and you're not all day long, you're not thinking of your breath. It's just happening. But you can, if you put your attention to it, you can hold your breath or breathe deeply or manipulate it in various ways. So it's something that happens on its own, but you can exercise will over it. And it's the same with thought. The thought is running on without your intervention most of the time, but you can decide to think about something. You want to plan your trip, or you want to figure out what's wrong with the car. Then you direct your thought, right? You have directed thought applied to a problem. And this is where, with mental training, you can gain more skill and more control over the thinking process. It's one of the characteristics of an arahant, a fully enlightened being. Is said that an arahant is the master of his mind. He thinks only what he wishes to think and not what he doesn't wish to think. So he's a complete mastery of that thinking process. But for everyone else who's not yet fully awakened, who's not yet an arahant, there is some element of autonomous thinking that's going on that we're not directing. And this is where we can get into trouble if we take it seriously. People come up with all kinds of ideas and often can fabricate illusions for themselves and do delusions. And the thoughts can run away with you, and it can carry on into action because of thinking about something that might have no actual basis in reality. Then you go out and do something foolish and get yourself in trouble. One of the more controlled or directed aspects of thought is like reason or logic. You can apply to a problem, thinking it through. It's a tool. It's something we can use for our own purposes, but it's not something that can be absolutely relied on. This is something that the Buddha would emphasize as one of the ways of coming to a false conclusion, is something hammered out by reason. If you're honest with yourself, you can see that we do that all the time. We make a decision based on an initial immediate emotional response, something we want, and then we come up with various reasons why that's the best thing. And then we can fool ourselves into thinking, well, I've thought it through and this is the best course of action. Reason is really, in a lot of ways, is like a lawyer. You hire to plead your case in court, and a good lawyer can argue either side of a case. Reason is like that. One of my teachers had a thing he would say is, if you're making a decision, the best thing to do is to flip a coin. He says it's not that the coin has any magic power, it's nothing to do with it, but while the coin's up in the air, you'll know what you really want. It'll come into your mind. Oh, I hope it comes up heads. Yeah. The Buddha would use forms of reasoning in his suttas. Some of the suttas are like logical arguments, and Some of them are like Socratic dialogues. These are things that using the reasoning power for an end. But he was always critical of philosophies or spiritual paths that were entirely based on reason, because that can't take you all the way. The unconditioned element is beyond reasoning, nibbana, because logic or reasoning is limited in its sphere to the conditioned. When the Buddha was asked, what is the fate of a Tathagata after death? And the question gave the form, does the Tathagata exist after death? And the Buddha said, no, that does not fit the case. Does he not exist? No, that does not fit the case. Does he both exist and not exist? That does not fit the case. Does he neither exist nor not exist? That does not fit the case. And that left his interlocutor completely baffled. What do you mean? How could you? Because, and this takes on a little bit added depth of meaning if you know a little something about ancient Indian thought. They had a logical system, like a mathematical logic, which was parallel to, but probably independently derived from the Greek logical system. And in ancient Greece, which most Western thought is based on, the logic is binary. It's either A or not A. And there's something called the law of the excluded middle. This is all from Aristotle. The Indian civilization developed a trickier kind of logic that's not binary, but quaternary, four-poled. So to express it in the Western symbology, the four poles are A, not A, both A and not A, and neither A nor not A. Those are the four possible poles. There's no law of the excluded middle. So the Buddha, by rejecting all four possibilities, is expressing that it can't be derived by reason. It's something that's beyond reason. Since the 20th century, we've known that logic or reasoning has an actual built-in practical limit. Bertrand Russell wrote this massive tome trying to derive all mathematics from first principles and devise an infallible logical system. He was followed by a fellow Gödel, who came up with the incompleteness theorem, which proved that any logical system can generate contradictions. There's no infallible logic. Well, a simple example of that is not exactly what Gödel was getting at, but a simple example is a statement, this statement is false. It's an internal contradiction or paradox there. So thought is a limited sphere. Yeah? And obviously most of our thoughts are not even at that elevated level of discipline of logic, but just kind of random connections. And very often human thinking is more like kind of magical thinking, just making connections that don't actually connect. Those things resemble each other. So thought process is something that not to be taken too seriously. Then there's the whole sphere of the emotions, which is a different level or process of mind. The basis, the rudimentary basis of all emotion is Vedana, is the feelings, which in Buddhist psychological theory, the feelings are very simple emotions that either something is perceived as pleasant, as unpleasant, or as neutral. And it's on a spectrum, so that pleasant can go from just, oh, this is okay, just sort of mildly pleasant, to rapturous bliss. Unpleasant goes from mild irritation to bone-shattering agony. It's on a spectrum, but it's all those qualities of pleasant and unpleasant, and neutral in the middle. The first thing to understand about the feelings is that they're not directly under our control. It's not like thought. We can't really direct the feelings. We can't just will ourselves to be happy or to be sad. We can train ourselves over time, but we can't immediately will the feelings. They're classed as a resultant. They, they just happen as a natural process. And a feeling arises at each moment with each object of consciousness. There's a feeling tone attached to it. It's felt as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And I think this is a very rudimentary and primitive level of mind that very simple organisms would have to have feelings. This is a practical way of categorizing the outer world. You know, a simple organism would see as pleasant those things that it could eat, and unpleasant those things which could eat it. And most of the rest of the stuff is just neutral. So there's a kind of practical aspect to feelings. The feelings are just this natural process of mind, and again, it's something that we can get caught by if we take them too seriously. If the pleasant feelings are sought after, then the mind is caught in craving. If the unpleasant feelings cause the mind to run away from them or to try and end them, then that leads to aversion, some form of negativity. And if the neutral feelings are not seen clearly, then this is ignorance or dullness. But if the feelings are seen clearly, then they're not in themselves a problem. This is just an unpleasant feeling or a painful feeling in the body. It's just a painful feeling. A pleasant sensation or a pleasant occurrence in the senses is just that. It's just a pleasant occurrence. There's one interesting aspect that has some important implications to contemplate is the way the feelings are categorized in the Abhidhamma as to which mental states they're associated with and not associated with. And unpleasant feeling is never associated with a skillful mental state. Pleasant feeling can be associated with skillful or unskillful. And it actually acts as a karmic intensifier. If you do a good deed, an act of kindness or generosity, and you feel happy about it, then it's more karmically effective. It's more powerful than if you do it reluctantly or just mechanically. If you're enthusiastic about it, it's more karmically powerful. And the same is true with a bad deed. If you do something cruel or hurtful, if you relish it and take joy in it, then it makes the karma worse. So pleasant feeling acts as a karmic intensifier. Pleasant feeling is also categorized as sensual and beyond the senses. We have pleasant feeling associated with the senses is obvious. Pleasant taste, sounds, smells, touches. Pleasant feeling that's beyond the senses is the joy and bliss that arises in meditation, the jhanic states that have upswellings of joy that have nothing to do with the senses. And this is a very purifying quality. The neutral feeling is upekkha when it's associated with a bright, clear mind is extremely beneficial. It's very liberating. You have to distinguish between that upekkha, which is spiritually positive and powerful, liberating, and that which is just dullness. They call in Thailand water buffalo equanimity. The equanimity of a water buffalo, which is usually a very placid beast. Upekkha as equanimity as a spiritual faculty is very powerful. this is the mind that's at peace. So the mind's not striving for this or that. It's not caught in aversion or attachment, but is neutral. So that all the contents of mind can be seen clearly and nothing is grasped. There's no clinging involved. This is a upekkha, equanimity. So these are, the feelings, and they're dependently arisen. They're empty. There's no self behind them, and they're not to be held onto, identified with, or given an undue importance. Perception is another mental content that occurs all the time and associated with sense consciousness. When we apply sense consciousness to any object, we hear a sound or we see a sight, smell something in the air, then the first mental processing, even before feeling kicks in, the first mental process is perception, which recognizes and qualifies the sense impression. And this is extremely important to understand to get a realistic view of how we relate to the outer world. The eye, for example, vision, only sees color and shape. And the mental process of perception is what sees a chair, a house, a tree, a man or a woman, a car. These things are the product of perception, which takes the raw information of color and shape and perceives an object. Now, what this means in practice is that the world we are living in is a self-generated mental illusion. Theravada Buddhism doesn't deny the reality of an external world. There were schools of Buddhism that did, but Theravada Buddhism does not. It postulates that there is an external world, but we don't know it directly. We only know sense impressions analyzed by perception. And the product of perception going on continually is to create a simulation. The world that we actually experience is a mental product and is limited. It's not a full picture of the external world because our sense apparatus is limited. A dog can hear sounds we cannot, and a bee can see colors we cannot. And we can see colors a dog cannot, right? There's every kind of organism, and to a lesser degree, every individual has a unique set of sense capabilities. And so that's the raw material that perception works on. So then perception manifests a world out of that, which is what we actually experience. And perception can be wrong. It can be fooled. The classic example given in the old text is the mistaken coil of rope for a snake. You're walking in a dark path at twilight and there's some rope on the road. You think it's a snake, and your perception actually sees a snake. I think in Northern Ontario, a more common experience would be mistaking a tree stump for a bear. Right? Who's done that? Walking at night or at twilight, and so your senses are alert because you're looking for any kind of danger, and there's a tree stump or a rock, and you're sure it's a bear. You see the shape of a bear for an instant. This is perception, right? And on a kind of more playful aspect, we sometimes play with perception, right? Like it's very common to look at clouds and see faces and shapes in clouds, right? That's your perception, just creating things. And if you get yourself into the right state of mind, you're sort of a relaxed state of mind, you can look at clouds, or fire is another one you can do this with, and see all kinds of shapes and faces, and they can be quite detailed and realistic. This is just perception, creating things. Perception at night when we're dreaming, perception is let free from the sense impressions and it just creates things out of its own imagination. So this is also important to know that perception, it's obviously dependently arisen, because it's arisen from past experience plus sense impressions, but it's also empty and void, not a real substantial entity. Yeah. And there's nobody doing it. There's just perception happening. Perhaps one of the trickiest aspects of mind to get a hold of is intention. This is cetana in Pali, which could be intention or will or volition. And this is a impulse that has to arise in the mind if we're going to do anything, even if you're going to, lift your arm to scratch your shoulder or something. It requires first an act of will, a mental act, right? Cetana or will. And it's perhaps, I think for a lot of people, this is one aspect where it's very difficult to see the not self in the will, because you think you're doing it, you're willing it. So one of the exercises in meditation is to try and pay particular attention to moments of intention, and begin with very coarse ones like the intention to move the body. If you're sitting in meditation a long time and your legs getting stiff and you want to recross your legs, then first of all, you should never, to begin with, you should never just thrash out and just change your posture carelessly. But first you should notice the discomfort. Then you should notice there's a decision to move. Then there's an intention to move, and then only then does the movement occur. Yeah. Many years ago, when I was in my early days of practicing meditation, one of the retreats I did in solitude, I had a time every day set aside for chores where I'd like sweep the floor, chop some wood, that kind of thing. And one day I was sweeping the floor and I found myself completely paralyzed, because I would see the intention arise in the mind to move the broom, and because I had seen it clearly with insight, it immediately expired and didn't pass into the consummation of moving the body. And I stayed like that for several minutes until I just had to make it like another conscious decision to, at this time of sweeping, I'm not going to meditate so intensely. I'll just let it sort of step back and see it more broadly, rather than try and pay attention to the momentary arisings. So you begin by looking at intentions and to move the body, and as that becomes more, you get a more control of that. You're never missing a coarse movement. Then there are a couple of bodily processes that are on the edge of being intentional, that you can make an effort to pay attention to, and this is a good exercise. One is swallowing. Periodically, our mouth fills with saliva and we swallow. And there's actually a small act of intention involved in that. It's not fully autonomous. And another one, even more subtle, is blinking. Occasional times we blink the eye. Yeah. There's actually a very, very light intention involved in that. If you can notice at that level, then even more subtle is the intention to think, taking it beyond the physical. And this is something that if you can see this, you're getting a real insight into the nature of the mind. You can get the mind so quiet that you can see the thought beginning to gel before it actually occurs. A visual analogy is like bubbles coming up in a thick viscous liquid. You can see it sort of forming, and then if you apply insight to it, you can stop it there. It doesn't have to go any further. The interesting thing is the thought does not yet have any content. It's just an intention to think. It's not yet a thought. It's just the mind beginning to move in that direction. Yeah. If you can see intention at those subtle levels, you can begin to understand how it's also without a self. It's just a coarse cumulative effect of many intentions going on all the time that we kind of formulate that somebody doing it. It's just a kind of a problem of scale in a way. So all these and more, all these processes of mind is something to make an effort to understand and to know. And then we can begin to work on shaping the mind, apply discipline to the mental processes, control the thoughts, encourage positive emotional states and not indulge in negative or painful ones, and develop skillful use of intention so that we're doing things that are useful and helpful. And in the end of the process is to free the mind. That the mind can be released from all these sankharas, all these processes, and realize that which is beyond all sankharas and all processes. I'll stop my remarks there, and we can have some tea and carry on with a little looser discussion, questions and answers.